So, good evening everybody and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James and I'm chairing it this evening for what is a rather unusual topic, I think, but one that I hope will be very interesting. Today I'll introduce the speakers one by one before they speak, and our first speaker is Mr. Akira Kitade, who's very kindly come over from Japan for this. And he's really here as a freelance writer, and he has recently published a book which is in both Japanese and in English, and indeed we have some copies downstairs in both languages, about the story of Chiune Sugihara. He was a Japanese diplomat who was based in Lithuania during the Second World War, and although being told not to by his superiors, wrote lots of visas to allow Jewish people to escape to Japan. And we're also very lucky today to have the number 2 from the Lithuanian embassy with us, so maybe she will also chip in later on. So, Kitade-san, can I ask you to start us off?
Excuse me.
I think he's going to start actually with a short video or film.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Mr. James, for your kind introduction. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be here today and to meet you on the occasion of my visit to London. You may well know already about the story of Chiune Sugihara, who is said to have rescued 6,000 Jewish lives during World War II. But very few people know about the story, how these Jewish people fled Europe and who helped their escape possible. I want to shed light on those ordinary Japanese citizens who worked behind the scenes and supported Mr. Sugihara's humanitarian deed. Now, let me start my story. Can you read the...
Yes.
This is the Rockefeller Center building in Manhattan, New York, in the year 1940. In this building sat the New York office of the Japan Tourist Bureau, which is the predecessor of Japan's largest travel agency, commonly known as JTB. One day, the phone rang in this office, and this is how it all began. The caller on the other end said, "Hello, I'm calling from a travel agency. Our company is now involved in the effort of rescuing Jews whose lives are threatened by the persecution of Nazi Germany. We are asking your company to transport these people from Vladivostok to Japan, and then from Japan to America. Would you be willing to accept?" Hazel Allison, who took the call, realized that the ripples of the Nazis' persecution had reached her workplace. The Kristallnacht, which occurred on November 9, 1938. The St. Louis incident in May 1939. Hazel went to her Japanese boss, but not being able to make the decision alone, he sent a telegram to Tokyo headquarters. As his telegram was being sent, he could easily imagine Tokyo headquarters confusion and dilemma, for at the time Japan was becoming increasingly pro-Germany. However, the conclusion was reached that on the basis of humanity, JTB should offer its assistance. What really ignited my interest in this subject was in meeting this handsome young man. His name is Tatsuo Osako. I met him in 1966, the year I graduated from university and began working for the Japan National Tourist Organization. Mr. Osako had been sent from JTB to the Japan National Tourist Organization in the same year to head the newly launched project, and I was assigned to work under him. Through my interactions with him, I was surprised to learn that Mr. Osako was once engaged in transporting Jewish refugees. He joined the Japan Tourist Bureau in 1938 upon graduation from a college in Tokyo. 2 years later, he was assigned to board a ship to transport Jewish refugees from Vladivostok to Tsuruga. The ship was an old 2,346-ton vessel called the Amakusa. According to Mr. Osako's memoir titled Memories of Transporting Jews, he served on the ship from the winter of 1940 until the spring of 1941, when the Sea of Japan is most notorious for its rough and stormy seas. In his memoir, he recalls, despite the rough winter seas, there were a few sunny days. On such days, we enjoyed the sun on the deck and walked around to keep ourselves healthy. Towards the end of his memoir, Mr. Osako recalls, I'm not sure that our Bureau's agents' efforts to assist and to service were fully grasped by the several thousand Jewish refugees, but I am certain that we proudly did our absolute best in following our mission as civilian diplomats. It was in 1998 that Mr. Osako showed me his memoir, and as I was engrossed in the exciting content, he handed me an aged album, saying, "See here, these are the photos from that time." In the album were portraits of 7 of the Jewish refugees whom he had assisted on board the ship. When the people in these photos escaped to Europe, having endured persecution by the Nazis, they must have fled without food or drink or a change of clothes. I was amazed that they would give Mr. Osako photos of themselves, each portrait doubtlessly a precious possession. Excuse me. Now, I'd like to show you these photos one by one. Each carries a handwritten message on the back. Of the 7, this is the only photo of a man. Mr. Osako has written a note which says he called himself Charles Boyer. Do you think he resembles Charles Boyer? The handwritten message reads, Mon bon souvenir à mon camarade Tatsuo Osako et Segalov le mars 4 1941. Is my French pronunciation good? Thank you very much. Her handwritten message is in an unidentified Scandinavian language, so I visited the Swedish embassy. The staff officer was kind enough to confirm that the language was Norwegian. It says, "To my friend in Japan." For a Scandinavian woman, faraway Japan would probably have been an unknown land. In this photo, the Bulgarian embassy confirmed that the message was indeed written in Bulgarian, and it said, "From Neni or Henny for your memories." This woman, with the most serene and calm expression, left a message in Polish. It simply says, "Remember me." It includes a date which may read October 2nd, 1940. There's no name signed. This woman's message says, "Remember me" in Polish, but she added, "to the nice Japanese person," showing her gratitude towards Mr. Osako. The signature looks like Rosia or Rosila, but it's not altogether clear. To be frank, I am most touched by this woman's photo. Perhaps it is because of her haunting expression, which seems to embody the suffering of the Jewish people who were persecuted by the German Nazis. This message is written neatly in French and says, "Avec tous mes sentiments," which means "with all my affection." It is signed Marie. The German message here says, "To dear Mr. Osako, March 22nd, 1941, on Amakusa Maru, Tony Alu something." She's the only one who references the Amakusa Maru by name. So why did these seven come to have their photos, leave their photos with Mr. Osako? Since seeing the photos in his album, these seven people have occupied a large space in my heart. I wonder where these people are now. I really want to trace their footsteps. I have no choice but to go and find them, I told myself. So on August 29, 2010, just 4 years ago, I left Narita Airport to visit Houston, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. This is Mrs. Edith Hamer, the first Sugihara survivor whom I met in Houston. She said, "I was only 3 years old when we arrived in the States through Japan, and so I remember nothing about those days. But a few years after we landed in the States, when I was a little older, my father returned all the money that he had borrowed from the American Jewish organization. I still remember how proud he was." She showed me this left side picture, which was taken on a ship called Nitamaru on their way to San Francisco in January 1941. This is Mr. Samir Mansky, whom you have just seen in the documentary. I was very surprised when he said, "To tell you the truth, I am suffering from cancer, but I am not afraid of dying at all. I survived a cruel destiny. Besides, I was blessed with my family. I will be 19 next month. This is the life that was saved by Mr. Sugihara. I am fully satisfied that I have lived this long." To my regret, he died on June 23, 2011, 9 months after I met him. This is Dr. Sylvius Mora, who lives in New York. Dr. Mora is well known in Japan among the people related to Sugihara visas, for she generously donated her father's passport to the town of Yaotsu, which is the birthplace of Mr. Sugihara. This is the passport stamped with the Sugihara visa, which saved the lives of her family. This is Mrs. Marsha Leon, who lives in New York. She's still working as a full-time journalist. She showed me several interesting pictures. These two were taken in June 1941 while she was staying in Kobe. When I saw these pictures, I was very much touched, for this shows there were heartwarming interactions between the Jewish refugees and the Kobe citizens. This is Mr. Benjamin Fisher, who lives in New York. He is still an active bank executive. When I showed him the Osaka album, he studied the photos carefully, but didn't recognize any of them. But when I mentioned that those 7 were on the Amakusa Maru, his expression suddenly changed, and he began talking a long story of his experiences on board the ship. As he was finishing his story, he showed me this picture very proudly, saying, "This is my entire family." This is Mr. Leo Melamed in Chicago, whom you probably know as the father of the financial futures market. He told me, "I understand the purpose of your coming here is that you are looking for someone related to the passengers on the Amakusa Maru. It's true that we were able to come to Japan thanks to that ship. When we trace the origin of our journey, it was surely thanks to Mr. Sugihara, and we were helped by Japan. Hearing your story, I now realize that we were also helped by a Japanese travel company. We were taken good care of by your former boss, Mr. Osako, too. I really appreciate it." Then I replied to his kind comments. My project began from my wish to spotlight the people who supported the great humanitarian act of Mr. Sugihara in a world where there was no recognition or fame for such an act. I simply wanted the people in the Jewish community to know it too. During our interview, Mr. Melamed listened to my faltering English with a gentle smile. His last words were the most encouraging. "You are right. Well, thank you very much. for coming from such a faraway place. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I showed the Osaka album to each of whom I met and asked if they knew someone in the album. But unfortunately, nobody could identify anyone of the 7 people. Perhaps the 70 years that have passed have created a wall which cannot be penetrated even with today's modern communication tools. By the way, of course you know these people, don't you? Why Mr. Clinton and Ms. Monica Lewinsky appear here all suddenly? The reason is October 23, 1998, the Chicago Tribune reported a profile of Monica Lewinsky in the Los Angeles Times suggested that Lewinsky's maternal grandfather was one of Sugihara Jews. So, if Mr. Sugihara had not issued that presidential scandal would not have erupted. I'm sorry, Mr. Clinton, about my joke, which is not appropriate to make in such a place like here. After I came back from the United States, I have had several occasions to speak about my research activities at various places in and outside Japan. Each time, I closed my speech by saying, "Where are you now?" Among the audience, there were some ladies who took a handkerchief and wiped tears. Probably their sympathy might have caused a miracle. Let me read the first paragraph of this article of the Japan Times. More than 70 years after her escape, a Jewish woman who fled persecutions by the Nazis in the early 1940s, thanks to a visa issued by Japanese diplomat Chiune Sugihara, has been identified. The woman was named Sonia Reed. I will never forget these 2 names, Zosia Gertler and Sonia Reed. As I take a look at these pictures, I'm convinced that Sonia lived a happy life with her family after she came to the United States. I'm now planning to visit New York this coming November to meet with her children, and I'm thinking to return the photo, their mother, to them. What I have talked tonight is all contained in my book, so I would appreciate your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Kitade-san. So that's an example of the impact caused by one act of conscience from certainly Sugihara-san and some other Japanese involved there. But I thought we ought to broaden the discussion out a bit more widely and talk about what conscience actually is, and who better to ask than a clergyman. In fact, who better to ask than a thoughtful clergyman? So I'm very lucky that we've got the Reverend Alistair Coles to come and tell us more.
It's an enormous pleasure to be here tonight and to speak in such distinguished company, and also to be shown how to use my computer by someone who's never seen it before. Thank you very much. But I'd like to thank Jason for his invitation. There are far better people to speak on conscience than I. I'm not suggesting that you blame him for my inadequacies, because that would be completely unfair, but rather that you reflect on his rather hopeful decision in inviting me in the light of the unfortunate experience of hearing me speak. Now, what I've said illustrates in part the operation of conscience. Conscience has something to do with knowledge, or awareness, or consciousness. It can be defined as our moral consciousness, our awareness of right and wrong actions. It's sometimes understood as operating instinctively, instantly even, whereas at other times it is something which takes us time in order to arrive at any clarity of conscience. Reflecting on questions like these can locate our thinking within certain traditions of moral reflection. But the themes I've mentioned, knowledge, awareness, consciousness, intention, application, these are some of the most central themes in the discussion of conscience. And I use them almost every day, not in teaching philosophy or ethics in lessons, but in asking questions to provide a framework for young people to use in making better decisions, decisions about their lives in very practical situations. Much of my time as a school chaplain is spent helping people get out of trouble and equipping them to stay out of trouble so that their trajectory of life is more creative. Many young people neither need nor wish to know the provenance of the ideas that generate the questions that I ask. Which philosopher, which theologian? They're more often looking for tools with which to understand themselves and their relationships, so that decisions which are often hampered by bad habits, vices, which generate chaos, can gradually be trained into better habits that are less destructive and more creative, virtues. And this process has the characteristics of skill acquisition and can happen in ways as varied as guided reflection or being coached as sport. I think I'm a slide behind. There we are. But creativity, I think, is a key theme, since moral awareness is an art rather than a science. It's hard to pin down at times exactly what we mean by this rather vague concept we call conscience. Perhaps a starting point is the phrase reputedly coined by Vincent van Gogh, who referred to conscience as man's compass. And probably many are aware that he studied theology before he studied art. But what I'm going to offer is a very brief outline view of some of the key elements of Western thought on conscience. The Greek word is suneidesis, meaning inherent knowledge. Conscience is a word that appears in classical Greek literature, where it has two meanings. It can mean what English speakers would understand as conscience, but it is also often translated as the word consciousness, a more general awareness. In fact, English is relatively unusual among modern languages in maintaining two such terms. German does it too, I believe, with Gewissen and Bewusst, but many other languages retain a more unified meaning. And this evening we're not short of people who might confirm or deny, advise in general, what the situation is in Japanese. But much of Western moral thought is rooted in the Judeo-Christian traditions. However, in Hebrew, there is no word for conscience, although terms such as heart and spirit are used in a similar sense in the Old Testament of the Bible. The first actual appearance of that Greek word, suneidesis, occurs in the Wisdom of Solomon, part of the so-called Old Testament Apocrypha, written in 1st or 2nd century BC in Greek. In the New Testament, the word occurs with some frequency, especially in the writings of St. Paul. He'd been exposed to much Hellenistic thought, and so I've just culled together some short examples of his usage. Firstly, from Romans chapter 2. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts, to which their own conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts will accuse or perhaps excuse them. Paul is targeting here Gentile people, non-Jewish people, and arguing with his Jewish hearers that they have a conscience too, and their keeping of a natural law is sometimes outstripping that of the Jews. Secondly, also in Romans, I am speaking the truth in Christ. I am not lying. My conscience confirms it by the Holy Spirit, asserting the validity of his argument with reference to his own conscience. And then in his first letter to the Christians of Corinth, concerning meat sacrificed to idols, it is not everyone, however, who has this knowledge, since some have become so accustomed to idols until now, they still think of the food they eat as food offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Paul is arguing here that idols do not really exist, and so, for those who understand the unity of the one true God, meat sacrificed to idols is meaninglessness, it is just meat. And yet some who are not as mature spiritually might be scandalized by such an act of a Christian eating meat which has a dubious provenance. And finally, in his second letter to the Corinthians, we have renounced the shameful things that one hides. We refuse to practice cunning or to falsify God's word, but by the open statement of the truth, we commend ourselves to the conscience of everyone in the sight of God. This is appealing to his reputation, perhaps, and to the positive awareness of other people, so possibly moving more towards the general sense of consciousness rather than conscience. What about after St. Paul? Well, among the early Christian writers, Paul's uses were often cited, but also drawn further towards the understanding that we have received in modernity, that conscience is something that can be clear, that we can act against, and that we can debase. Firstly, the great Christian thinker Origen talks about acting contrary to the conscience, or injuring a weak person by offending his weak conscience. And then the writer Tertullian, in a rather typically sharp phrase, else you pollute your conscience by your neighbour's ignorance. It's really relating to a similar attitude towards pagans who surrounded Christians in their society, that if their own standards of behaviour were somewhat higher, they should be careful about taking on the habits of those who live next door. It might not bother your neighbour, but it should bother you. Well, in reading these short passages, almost without knowing it, we've made a linguistic and cultural step, in that Tertullian wrote not in Greek, but in Latin. And I'm introducing two new words here, along with suneidesis, the Latin word conscientia, which is very straightforward, and also synteresis. Synteresis is a word which is often used by Latin writers, and there's a rather amusing story about its provenance. It seems that St. Jerome, in translating some Greek, miswrote it. It's actually an attempt at transliterating suneidesis, the Greek word, into Latin, but he got it a little bit wrong. So synteresis is there as well as something quite important in Latin teaching. The word conscientia is one that Tertullian uses mostly, though. And there might even be hints of sharpness in his compact and precise use of Latin, a compact and precise language that was to be exploited to enormous effect by one of the West's greatest saints. St. Augustine of Hippo was a reluctant convert to Christianity, but one of its greatest thinkers. His Confessions is an autobiographical work covering his early life, and it's written as a conversation or a prayer to God, and deals occasionally with conscience. An example from that work. And now had the day arrived in which I was to be laid bare to myself, and my conscience was to chide me. What's implicit in some Christian writers, Augustine makes explicit. Conscience is an interior gift from God, who is the source of all virtue. It is the voice of God, and therefore carries great authority. Conscience is the outflowing of divine love, and therefore cannot be questioned. But Augustine's thought on conscience is a little bit more complex than that. It's not simply the voice of God, since elsewhere he writes of a more subtle and reflective faculty. He also questions whether an innate knowledge of good and evil is viable, since human reason, as with every human faculty, is imperfect, emphasizing, as he does, the need for trust in Scripture and the teachings of the Church, external authorities, as well as our own judgment. And there's another quotation here from his commentary on St. John's epistles. Return to your conscience, question it, turn inwards, brethren, and in everything you do, see God as your witness. Well, some historians argue that Augustine's descriptions of conscience and his spirituality in general had no greater effect than here in the British Isles, where medieval urban life was often clustered around cloisters governed by Augustine's rule. There's my local one in Dunstable. There's a little bit of it left, which is used as a parish church, but it was the centre of the population and of culture for hundreds of years. Other religious orders had contrasting approaches to that of the Augustinian orders. Franciscans, like St. Bonaventure, tended to emphasize the part played by innate emotional awareness and the will in the operation of conscience, while the Dominicans emphasized an intellectual basis. It was the rational approach that became dominant in the scholastic period through the work of the Dominican St. Thomas Aquinas, here on the right. Thomas based his theory of the conscience on the concept that we've already touched upon in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, that there is something innate in the human faculty of intellect or reason concerned with human nature itself, a gift from God that enables people to understand right and wrong, a natural law which guides the conscience away from evil and towards good. What Thomas actually argued is that we apply our knowledge of good and evil to what we do or are considering to do in order to make a decision. The instinctive faculty of resisting evil and doing good he calls synteresis, that strange accidental word, tending to reserve conscientia for the reasoning part in applying our natural sense to concrete situations. And in this, classicists might know that he's very close to Aristotle's use of the word phronesis, practical wisdom. Thomas actually argued that if we have a reasonable sense of synteresis, and if we work through the conscientia stage as best as we can in the given circumstances, then technically we can't be blamed for the outcome. And even if our knowledge is partial, which it always is, we must still act on our conscience. For if we don't follow our own moral awareness, we have no power to make moral decisions at all. In a rather bizarre example, Thomas argues that if a man sleeps with another man's wife, whom he mistakes for his own, this isn't Monk writing, I hasten to add, then he is not blameworthy, because he was acting in good faith. Bad eyesight. Of course, there's a heavy responsibility to educate and inform the conscience throughout one's life. And Thomas saw a qualitative difference between being in error and being in ignorance. Unwittingly breaking a rule is an error, whereas pleading ignorance of the inherent evil of the act of murder would be no defence at all. And Thomas summarises himself rather well. Conscience is reason making right decisions, not a voice giving us commands. Although it's not clear from a sea change in Augustinian ethics at the moment whether Augustine would actually feel any offence in that latter part. Well, perhaps because of its rational bent, Thomistic notions of conscience were palatable to many Reformed and Enlightenment thinkers. We find a modified form of Thomas's teaching in the preaching of the Anglican moral philosopher, theologian and bishop Thomas Butler, who used this definition: "There is a principle of reflection in men by which they distinguish between approval and disapproval of their own actions. This principle in man is conscience." Butler assumed that conscience was a faculty that could operate prospectively or retrospectively about our own actions or those of another person. As with St. Thomas's understanding of synteresis, he was confident that we possess an innate sense of right and wrong, upon which we can reflect. And this sense he often described in terms of principal desires for self-love and for benevolence, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Conscience prompts us to work towards benevolence rather than being satisfied solely with egoism, although the one need not pollute the other. He is not an idealist or a perfectionist. But there is a strong contrast between Thomas and Butler in the latter's assertion that conscience is intuitive rather than reflective. It gives us an immediate sense of the moral quality of an action that must be obeyed. And perhaps ironically, it's a combination of these two influences, St. Thomas Aquinas and the Anglican Bishop Butler, that could be argued describes much of the current basis of Catholic moral thought on conscience. And this is because Butler's influence was found in the work of John Henry Newman, another Anglican priest who was to convert to Roman Catholicism and was beatified by Pope Benedict in 2010. That is, made almost a saint. Blessed John Henry Newman agreed with Butler's account of conscience because it resonated with his own inner experience. Conscience implies a relation between the soul and something exterior, and that moreover superior to itself, a relation to an excellence which it does not possess, and to a tribunal over which it has no power. This excellence and tribunal is for Blessed John nothing other than God's providential ordering, and may even describe the growing clarity which eventually led to his conversion. There's another passage here. "And since the more closely this inward monitor is respected and followed, the clearer and more exalted and more varied its dictates become, and the standard of excellence is ever outstripping while it guides our obedience, a moral conviction is thus at length obtained." Well, with such a high doctrine of conscience as that of Blessed John Henry, it would be unfair to neglect some of the challenges to this tradition that arose in the 20th century, even though these tend to be rather more familiar to us in our culture now. There are so many to choose from, but perhaps Sigmund Freud was the first to suggest that, far from being a gift, the voice of conscience might simply be the disguised voice of a parent from early childhood, mediated through the structures of the subconscious. Assigning authority to such a source of guidance, Freud argued, was entirely misplaced. Such a voice should, in adulthood, not be trusted, but questioned rigorously if a person was to avoid regression to infantile dependence. Freud, in fact, used the concept of conscience as a convenient subconscious receptacle for all the negative feelings that a person had ever experienced from parents, family, and society, and especially religion, the location of all the guilt and the shame. It's hard to reconcile this with a theology of conscience, since there seems to be no room for God at all. However, since Freud was an avowed atheist, albeit of Jewish ancestry, perhaps that's not a major concern for him or for us. A more nuanced view on conscience was offered by Erich Fromm, who articulated two contrasting mechanisms. The first from a remarkable perspective. Fromm experienced the rise of Nazi Germany as a German Jew, but escaped and settled in the United States. His concept of the authoritarian conscience was based on his own experience of the subversion of conscience and freedom by evil authoritarianism. In what appears very much like Freud's rather frightening concept of the conscience, but this time on steroids, Fromm argued that the authoritarian conscience was the internalized voice of external authority, where any moral critique had been silenced by a strange symbiosis of the fear of punishment and the idealization of the authority figure, so that the laws and sanctions, as he puts it, of the external authority become part of oneself. The authoritarian conscience is not obeyed because it is good, but because it is powerful, enough to bypass the moral sense and enable otherwise civilized people to be perpetrators of unspeakable barbarity. Finally, Fromm's later articulation is entitled Humanistic Conscience, and is what he envisaged flourishing where there is no domineering external authority. This was, he argued, our own voice, present in every human being, and independent of external sanctions and rewards, the core of our being and our true selves, discovered by reflecting on our deepest needs, desires, and yearnings. The result of listening to this conscience, he argues, is to release potential and creativity, the goal of which is productiveness and therefore happiness. Conscience in Fromm perhaps gives two sides of the coin, of its operation in freedom and relative comfort, and also its operation under conditions of extreme fear and persecution. But I hope that both our discussions this evening will outline very clearly that conscience is something which enables people, even in times of great darkness, to shine as bright lights.